It's good to see you all here. We're still in our study in the book of Exodus. We had a break last week. We had a guest speaker here from Eastern European Missions last week, and so he gave us an update during class, and so we were thankful to have him here for that. There's still some materials that are in the foyer. If you want some information on East European Missions, they try to provide Bibles all over the world, but especially into Eastern Europe and into the Ukraine and into Russia. And some of that material is still out there in the foyer. So we're going to pick up from where we were a couple weeks ago in Exodus. And we had just finished chapter 22. The children of Israel have made it to Mount Sinai, and God has given them the Ten Commandments. And he is explaining to Moses some of the laws and the stipulations that are in addition to those Ten Commandments. When we think about the Old Testament law, or we think about the law of Moses, it is more than just the Ten Commandments. There's actually 613 total commandments in the law. And so he's expounding on some of these things. Some of these things are religious commands. Some of them are ceremonial commands. Some of them are civil or civic commands and how they are to deal with one another, and laws for how they interact with other folks. And so there's some different things that are in here. So we had some of those civil commands, some of that civil law or civic law in chapter 22. And he's going to kind of continue with those things as we get into chapter 23. Notice in the first few verses here, chapter 23, says, "You shall not circulate a false report. Do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. You shall not show partiality to a poor man in his dispute. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, and you shall surely bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying under its burden, and you would refrain from helping it, you shall surely help him with it. You shall not pervert the judgment of your poor in his dispute. Keep yourself far from a false matter. Do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not justify the wicked." Now he's going to continue to talk about this with regards to judgment. And so really what he's talking about here is judgment, that when you make a judgment, when you are a witness to something, that you need to be honest in what it is that you do, right? You shall not circulate a false report. Well, this goes along with one of those 10 commandments from Exodus chapter 20 and verse 16, right? That you are not to bear false witness. And so don't circulate a false report. Don't put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. Can you think of a case where they went and they found some unrighteous witnesses, or they circulated a false report about someone? Jesus. Right? In Jesus' trial, they had to find people that were willing to be false witnesses. And so that's the one that usually we think of first, right? That the way that he was railroaded, that he hadn't done anything wrong, right? But they went and they found some false witnesses. Now, the Jews who did that didn't have any problem with paying 30 pieces of silver to Judas to sell Jesus out, right? They didn't have any problems with paying the blood money. Right? They didn't have any problems with drumming up some false witnesses and bringing false charges so that they could execute Jesus. But they were too righteous to take the money that Judas had back and put it in the treasury, because that was blood money, right? They used it to buy the potter's field, and we saw that a couple weeks ago. I was going to say last week, but it wasn't last week. It was the last time I taught. Feels like last week. Funny how the week goes by in a hurry when there's a holiday in there, right? But the 30 pieces of silver was the price of a slave, right? And so they, when he threw it back into the treasury, well, they didn't want it. They bought the potter's field with that. But there's another time where they brought up unrighteous witnesses, where they trumped up charges against somebody. Over in Acts chapter 6, in verse 11, Stephen has been preaching to them, and he's going to tell them what they don't want to hear. In Acts chapter 7, they're going to stone him to death. But notice in Acts chapter 6 and verse 11, it says, they secretly induced men to say, we have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and against God. And they stirred up the people, the elders and the scribes. And they came upon him, seized him, and brought him to the council. They also set up false witnesses who said, this man does not cease to speak blasphemous words against this holy place and the law. And so we don't typically think of Stephen as one who had false witnesses brought against him, but in Acts chapter 6 says that that's what they did. Well, they're breaking the law. They're breaking their own law here, right? Well, he's speaking blasphemy, so let's get some false witnesses, which the law says you're not supposed to do. So they didn't have a problem when it fit what it was that they wanted. So don't circulate a false report. Verse 2, don't follow a crowd to do evil. How many times have you heard, or maybe you've used this excuse when you were a child? Right? Well, everyone's doing it, or you know, Susie's going, can I go? And I don't. If your friends were jumping off of a bridge, right? Would you jump too? Don't follow a crowd to do evil. Sometimes people get into a mob mentality where everybody's doing something that's wrong, and we think, well, because everyone's doing it, it must be okay, or because it's legal, maybe in our country, well, then it must be okay. Don't follow a crowd to do evil. Doesn't matter if most of the people are doing that. Are most of the people going to be saved? Most of the people going down the right path? Right, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7 that most folks are following that broad way that leads to destruction. Don't follow a crowd to do evil. Don't testify in a dispute to turn aside after many to pervert justice. And that's what the whole thing is. God wants justice to be right. If we're going to make a judgment, if we're going to have some sort of judgment that takes place or some sort of justice that takes place, he wants that to be correct. He doesn't want justice to be perverted. And so verses 3 and 6 go along with that. Notice, you shall not show partiality to a poor man in his dispute. Right? Don't side with the poor man just because he's poor. Oh, he's poor. We need to have sympathy on him, so we're going to take his side in a dispute whether he's got a case or not. Don't show partiality to a poor man in his dispute. But equally, notice verse 6. Verses 3 and 6 here kind of go together. He says, you shall not pervert the judgment of your poor in his dispute. So don't judge against the poor man just because he is poor. I'm going to judge for this rich guy because maybe the rich guy will give me something, right? Maybe I'll get some sort of bribe. Maybe I'll get some sort of, money from him. Maybe I'll get some sort of benefit. Maybe he'll give me a job if I take his side in this. Because the poor guy, what can the poor guy give me? Well, he can't really give me anything, right? I can't get anything from that. And so don't pervert justice here is really the message, right? Don't show partiality towards the poor because he's poor. Don't rule against him because he's poor. And don't rule in his favor just because he's poor either. Comments or questions on these things? Do we ever see that in our society, that people... James talked about this, right? That the rich man comes in and you give him the best seat, but the poor man, you say, well, sit here and you be my footstool, right? You take this position or this place that's of dishonor because he's a poor person and can't do anything for you. And James says, don't do that. So we've got that kind of repeated in the New Testament, that we are to treat the poor poorly because they're poor, but also don't just side with the poor because they are poor. Verses 4 and 5, if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey, one who hates you, lying under its burden, you need to help it, right? Even though you maybe have an enemy or you've got somebody that's against you, or maybe it's some sort of, you're going to trial against somebody and you see their donkey wandering away, and it's like, I'm not going to help that guy, right? I'm not going to bring his donkey back to him, or his donkey's laying under a heavy burden. It's not the animal's fault, right? It's kind of the idea here. Why would you take it out on the animal itself? I know you got some sort of snarky remark. I can see it by the look on your face. So if you see your enemy teammate, I guess, lying on the field, you reach out a hand and you help him get up. You don't step on him after the play's over. If we bring this to yesterday, I suppose. But don't take it out on the animals, right? And so sometimes people will not necessarily, we're not an agricultural society anymore, but sometimes when people have a dispute with somebody, do they have a tendency to want to bring their kids into it? Sometimes attacking the kids, well, it's not the kid's fault, right? Why are you attacking the kids? Why are you going after this person's animal, or why are you not helping this person's animal if they're in distress, just because you've got a case or something against that particular person? And so the law here says you're not to do that, right? You're to treat people the way that you would want to be treated. And Jesus says in the New Testament that that's the golden rule, right? That's how we are to operate with others, is to treat others the way that we want to be treated. So don't pervert the judgment of your poor in his dispute. In verse 7, keep yourself far from a false matter. Do not kill the innocent and righteous. I will not justify the wicked. So you need to make sure, right? And you need that needs to be some sort of diligence here. If you're going to put someone to death for something, you need to make sure that you've got 2 or 3 witnesses. The Mosaic Law, if you were going to execute someone, or if you were going to accuse someone of something and make it stick, you had to have 2 or 3 witnesses. It couldn't be just he said, she said, right? It couldn't just be from the mouth of one witness. And so there needed to be some diligence here for what it was, the kind of judgments that you were going to make. Verse 8, you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. Right? I think that it's not a mistake that he's putting this in here, right? It goes along with what he's been talking about. Because, I'm going to pervert justice, I'm going to rule against the poor man because the rich man can give me a bribe. He can pay me something. I can benefit from that particular judgment. And God says he's not going to justify the wicked. God is a merciful God, right? God extends mercy to thousands. Does God want all men to be saved? Does God want to be merciful towards everyone? Now, is God going to show mercy towards everyone? No, because it says he's not going to justify the wicked, right? The wicked's not going to get away with what it is that they've done if they don't repent, if they don't turn from what they're doing and live a different way. He's not going to justify the wicked. Even though God is merciful and God wants to show mercy, God's going to be true to himself. He's going to keep his word, and he's not going to justify the wicked. So don't take any bribes, right? A bribe is going to pervert justice. Verse 9, also you shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And so because of them being strangers, right, them being pilgrims, if you will, in the land of Egypt, that they were foreigners there, that they are not to oppress those that are foreigners. They're not to oppress those that are strangers. They're to remember where it is that they've come from and not do the same thing to other people that's been done to them. Sometimes we want righteousness, right? We want justice, and we don't want it to be equal, right? Because we don't want to, like a lot of times, we don't want to get even, we want to get ahead. And so in the law, there was a prescription for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And that wasn't meant to be harsh. It was meant to keep them from going beyond, right? And saying, well, you beat my team, I want to burn your stadium down, kind of thing, right? It's not equal justice. Comments or questions on these things? In the next section, he's going to talk about the Sabbath year. There were to be a Sabbath year. This will come up more in Leviticus and Numbers as God continues to expound upon the law here. But in verse 10 it says, 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its produce, but the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field may eat. In like manner you shall do with your vineyard and your olive grove. 6 days you shall do your work, and on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the son of your female servant, the stranger, may be refreshed. And in all that I have said to you, be circumspect and make no mention of the name of other gods, nor let it be heard from your mouth. So the Sabbath day, right, it was part of the Ten Commandments. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, that they were to work for 6 days, and they were to rest on the 7th day. Do you remember why God said that back in Exodus chapter 20, that they were to do that? Yeah, it was a replication of what God had done, right? That God created the world and everything that was in it in 6 days, and on the 7th day he rested and he hallowed the seventh day. And so they were to work for 6 days, but they were to not work on the seventh day. Now, they didn't always keep that. Right? They didn't always do what they were supposed to do. They didn't hallow that seventh day. And likewise with the land, because again, they're by and large an agricultural society, or going to be an agricultural society once they settle in the land of Canaan. And he says, 6 years you shall sow your land and gather its produce, but in the seventh year you let it rest. You let the land, so the land gets a rest. Now the land doesn't get a rest, one out of every 7 days. You couldn't do that. But the land was going to get a rest 1 year out of every 7. So 6 years you were going to plant. The seventh year you were going to just let it go. Now when you let it go, the things that you had planted, right, seed had fallen to the ground, you're going to have some wild growth that's just going to take place naturally, right? So if you've got a wheat field, you're going to have some wheat that's going to grow in that seventh year on its own. If you've got a vineyard, right, you're going to have some grapes that are going to come from those vines in that seventh year, but you were not to go out and harvest any of those things. Those things were to be for the poor, right? When there's another law that goes in with this, I want to say it's over in Leviticus, that when you were to gather your harvest, that you weren't to harvest the corners of your field, right? So if you had a square field, right, you'd come across in that corner, you'd kind of leave that corner there. So whether it was wheat or whether it was grapes or whatever it was that you were growing, you would leave that corner there. So the people that were poor could come and they could glean something from that, right? And they could find something to eat, those who didn't have anything. And so it was a benefit to them. It was a way for them to be able to take care of the poor. You see that in the book of Ruth. Because Ruth goes out and she wants to go into Boaz's field and she wants to go into those corners, right, that haven't been harvested, and she wants to gather there. And Boaz tells Ruth, no, you don't go there. You follow along with my men and you pick up whatever it is that you want to pick up. So Boaz allows her to go into the bulk of his field and to gather up whatever she wants to gather up for her and her mother-in-law. So Boaz shows her a kindness there in the book of Ruth, but she would have wanted those corners, right? And so these would be for the beasts of the field to eat. Now God cares for the animals, right? He cares for the sparrows. God feeds the birds, right? In Matthew chapter 6, when he's saying, why are you worrying about these things? Notice the birds of the field. Doesn't your heavenly Father feed them? Well, this was a way that God was going to feed the beasts and the birds, that this was going to lie fallow once every 7 years. Now, it looks like that this may have been cyclical, right? If I start my farm this year, well, I'm going to farm for 6 years, and then on the seventh year, I'm going to let it rest. Let's say Jacob starts his farm 2 years from now. He's going to do 6 years, and then he's going to let his rest, but his seventh year is going to be different than my seventh year. So if you're poor or if you're a bird, in the seventh year you find something in my field, well, a couple years later you're going to find something over in Jacob's field, because that's going to be his seventh year when he's going to let his go. It seems that was the way that this was done for a certain time period, and then maybe once they got settled more in the land and once things got more regulated, that seventh year became the same year for everybody, that year of Sabbath. Because there's some other things that take place in the sabbatical year that are written over in the book of Numbers. This has a benefit to the land as well. If you've ever done any farming, if you've ever done any agricultural work, when you plant something, it takes minerals from the soil. And being in Ohio and living in farm country in Ohio, I would notice that the farmers, they'd plant corn this year, they'd plant soybeans next year. The third year, they'd let the field go, and then they'd plow that under, and then they'd start over again, because the corn and the wheat use different, and the soybeans use different minerals from the soil. Letting the land rest for a year allows those minerals to replenish. They don't have a way really of being able to lime their fields. They can't go down to Lowe's or Home Depot and get a couple bags of fertilizer, right, in order to put that out there on their crops. And so this was a way that God had for the land to continue to produce for them. It also shows a faith in God, doesn't it? I'm going to grow for 6 years, but then I'm not going to grow anything for the seventh. What am I going to eat the seventh year? What am I going to eat the eighth year? Right? God made it so that the produce that they got off that sixth year was going to be enough to last them for the seventh year and the eighth year. And then later on, there's a law about the year of Jubilee. So you got every 7 years, I'm not planting anything. The year of Jubilee was once every 50 years. So 7 sevens is 49. So when I get to like year 48, I'm planting year 48, and I'm growing in year 48, but year 49, that's a seventh year, that's a year of Sabbath rest. I'm not planting anything that year. Year 50 is the year of Jubilee. I'm not planting anything that year. And God says, you have faith in me, you'll have enough that it'll last you for those 2 years that you're not planting. They had a whole year that they took off, the year of Jubilee. Right? Imagine that, taking a year off from your job, spending time worshiping God and spending time with your family for a whole year. I think that'd be kind of cool. A lot of people would be like, church for a whole year? Can't even get in come Wednesday night. Getting people to come to church for a whole year, you're going to have a hard time maybe with that now. But there were benefits to this. And it showed that they needed to put their faith in God, right? That's what this was all about, right? Jesus prayed, give us this day our daily bread. Right? They understood the idea of their daily bread. They understood that they needed to rely upon God for what it is that they had from day to day. And the whole idea behind this, letting the land rest in the seventh year, was, are you going to trust in God to do what he says, to not plant anything that year, or are you going to do your own thing? You're not going to have faith in God. You're not going to trust in God. You're going to think, I need to have something to eat. I'm going to go out there and plant anyways. What do you think the nation of Israel did? What do you think they did in that seventh year? They planted. Right? They planted. They didn't give the land its rest like they were supposed to. And when God takes them off into captivity for 70 years, God tells the children of Israel, the land's going to get its rest now. The rest that you didn't give it. It's going to get 70 years now of rest. Because 70 years would be, 490 years worth of them not letting the land rest? He's going to make up for it by having the land rest while they're in captivity. And so 6 days, he says, you shall do your work. The seventh day you shall rest, so that your animals can get some rest, so that your servants can get some rest. 6 days a week is enough for folks to be working so that they could be refreshed, so that they can remember the Lord on that seventh day. He says, be circumspect. Make no mention of the name of other gods. So he's going to say, when you get into the land of Canaan, don't ask them, well, who's your God? Don't ask them, well, what do you do for your religious services? What do you do to worship? Don't even ask about those things. Don't even have the name of other gods on your lips, right? Don't let it be heard from your mouth. I thought there was a place over in the New Testament that said something similar, and I'm forgetting. Paul may be referring to this in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 3, or something similar in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 3. Right? Don't make mention of the names of these other gods. Well, in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 3, Paul says, but fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not even be named among you, as is fitting for saints. So don't even talk about those things, right? And fornication and uncleanness and covetousness, well, that kind of went along with all of these pagan practices. It went along with all these pagan religions. When they would get together and worship, they had temple prostitutes, and there was a lot of things that were going on that were sexually immoral and unclean, right? And he says, don't mention the name of these other gods here in the Mosaic Law. Paul says similarly, right? Don't be talking. These aren't fit things for Christians to be talking about. Comments or questions through chapter 23, verse 13. Cruising along, Jacob. We may finish Exodus before you finish Life of Christ. I'm not sure. It's going to be close. Next, he mentions 3 annual feasts. There are 3 times that the males of Israel were required to appear before the Lord wherever it is that he was going to place his name. Now, shortly, he's going to place his name at wherever the tabernacle is, but the tabernacle's not built yet. Later, he's going to place his name in Jerusalem where the temple is, and that's where they would have to come to bring these sacrifices. But notice, he says here in verse 14, 3 times you shall keep a feast to me in the year. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. You shall eat unleavened bread 7 days, as I commanded you, at the appointed time in the month of Abib, for in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty. And the feast of harvest, the first fruit of your labors, which you have sown in the field. And the feast of ingathering at the end of the year, when you have gathered in the fruit of your labors from the field. 3 times in the year all your males shall appear before the Lord God. So there were 3 feasts that they were required to keep. Now there were additional feasts that were given to them, but for these particular 3 feasts, the men had to appear before the Lord. They had to come to wherever that tabernacle was, or again in Jerusalem once the temple is there. And the first of those is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This Feast of Unleavened Bread goes along with Passover. We saw this when they came out of Egypt, that they observed the Passover meal, and with that Passover meal there were 7 days where they weren't allowed to have any leaven in their house at all. That they were partake of unleavened bread, and that was to remind them of how they left Egypt in haste. They couldn't wait for the bread to rise. They couldn't wait for it to be finished being kneaded in their bowls. That they left Egypt in haste, and so that unleavened bread would be with them for 7 days. And so that's the time of Passover, and that typically takes place somewhere March or April. It depends on how the calendar falls. But that would be that for the Jews, that'd be their first month. That'd be the month of Abib, when they would partake of that. And verse 16, the feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labors. Now sometimes this is referred to as feast of harvest, sometimes it's the feast of the first fruits. It's also referred to as Pentecost. And so sometimes, like I said, it's referred to as the Feast of Weeks, because you got basically 7 weeks between Passover and Pentecost, right? There's 50 days that are in there. And so they would sometimes call that the Feast of Weeks. We'll see that in Exodus chapter 34 and verse 22. It says, you shall observe the Feast of Weeks, of the first fruits of wheat harvest, and the Feast of Ingathering at the year's end. So if you go 50 days forward from March, April time period, that's going to put you somewhere May or June, that this would take place, the Pentecost would happen, or the Feast of Weeks would take place. Yeah, it's in Numbers chapter 28 and verse 26. Also on the day of the first fruits, when you bring a new grain offering to the Lord at your Feast of Weeks, you shall have a holy convocation. You shall do no customary work. So these feasts were kind of like Sabbath days. You know, why is this being mentioned? He just talked about the Sabbath day. He talked about the Sabbath year for the land, talked about the Sabbath day. Well, these feasts are going to be like Sabbath day rests. Doesn't matter which day of the week they fall upon. Could be that it's a Thursday, could be that it's a Friday, could be that it's a Sunday. And so you might have 2 Sabbaths that week, right? Because you'd have this feast day where you wouldn't do any work, and then you'd have the Sabbath day on Saturday when you wouldn't do any work. The 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, you'd have a whole week there, right? That you'd be not doing what you would normally do. And so this Feast of Harvest, the first fruits of your labors. And then the Feast of the Ingathering was also referred to as the Feast of Tabernacles. It was to remind them that they lived in tents, that they were nomadic people, that they were wandering about before they came here into the land of Canaan and had houses then for themselves. In Deuteronomy chapter 16 and verse 13, it says, you shall observe the Feast of Tabernacles 7 days when you have gathered from your threshing floor and from your winepress. And so this would be at the end of the growing season, right? So we'd be looking at somewhere maybe September, October time period that this would take place. And so these 3 times a year, right, all of the males were required to appear before the Lord. If you're still in Deuteronomy 16, it says in verse 16 there, 3 times a year all your males shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses, at the Feast of Unleavened Bread, at the Feast of Weeks, and at the Feast of Tabernacles, and they shall not appear before the Lord empty-handed. When they were to come to these various feasts, and they were to come to these various celebrations, they were to bring their offerings with them. They were not to come empty-handed. They were to give of what it was that they had. They were to bring those sacrifices to the Lord. And we'll see that they were to have burnt offerings and they were to have peace offerings. And with the peace offering, you'd sit down You'd basically have a fellowship meal when you had a peace offering. Comments or questions on these things? I think about this. I think about how much time this would have required from them. Right? Feast of Weeks is coming. I've got to pack up my sacrifice, or I've got to take something that I can trade, right, in order to buy a sacrifice when I get to Jerusalem. And I've got to I got to travel to Jerusalem. I got to maybe spend a week there if it's the Feast of Weeks, right? I have to spend some time there. I have to bring something. Do people complain today about going to church? Right, and sometimes people, when you talk to folks, and they'll ask you, well, what do you do? What does your group do? And you talk about, well, we come together on Sunday morning, and we often have a worship service on Sunday night, and we have a Bible study on Wednesday, and it blows their mind, right? If they're from a denominational background, it's like, you go to church 3 times a week, and because they think that a half an hour, on Saturday night or Sunday morning ought to be enough for the whole week. These folks spend a lot more time worshiping God than even we do, right? When we talk about coming together 3 times a week, they spend a lot more time at it, and it was a lot that was required from them. And sometimes we complain at the little bit that we have to do, but 4 hours, I think that what a week is 168 hours. 4 hours out of 168 isn't that big of a time. Yes.
Yourself as a living sacrifice. Even today, though we don't have to go through all of that they went through, we're still not supposed to come to God empty-handed. And you're also still supposed to bring him your best. So you don't sit there and half bring yourself into the assembly, half sleep, half dressed, not any thought to what you're worshiping and why you're worshiping. And then just because you brought an empty bodysuit to the building, you walk out feeling as if you gave God something grand and awesome, when really you gave him nothing. So you have to think about that you can't bring God any old thing and nothing. You have to bring him everything.
Yeah, it's a good point. God wants our best, and he wants their best, right? They're not to come empty-handed, that they're to bring their sacrifice. And what sacrifice are they to bring? Well, when they bring something for a burnt offering or they bring something for a sin offering, it had to be the best that they had. It had to be without blemish, right? You couldn't bring, well, I got this 3-legged mule, and I'm not going to really use him for anything anyway, so I'll just sacrifice him to God, and I'll that'll fulfill my obligation to God. Now, God doesn't want that. He doesn't want the 3-legged lambs, right? He doesn't want the sick and the lame animals. Because later on, when they come back from captivity, some of them are going to be offering that. And in the book of Malachi, God says, why don't you give that to your governor? If your governor came and was going to eat at your house, you wouldn't sacrifice that animal and feed it to him because you'd be ashamed to do that. But they're giving that to God, right? And likewise, if we just come and we're just an empty shell, and we just sit in the pew, and we're not really thinking about worshiping God. We're not really participating in worshiping God. We're thinking about where we're going when we leave here, or what it is that we're having for lunch. We got a problem, because we're not bringing God our best, right? God wants us to not come empty-handed. Now, sometimes we'll talk about that with regards to financial giving, and God has certainly told us that he wants us to give of our means. We see that in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, and it's important that we fulfill that command. But does God need our money? Really? I mean, who does the money belong to in the first place? God, right? God has everything that's in this world, right? Psalm 50, I think it is, says that he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Well, that's used figuratively. It doesn't mean when you get to the 1,001st hill that cow belongs to somebody else. It's to illustrate that, all the cattle belong to God, right? God owns everything. And so when we give something to God from our means, we're just giving back to him something that already belongs to him anyways. But we have something that we can give God that God can't give himself. We have something that we can give God that God doesn't already have, and that's us. Because he's given us free will to make that choice. He doesn't force us. And so Paul talks in Romans chapter 12 that we are to present ourselves as a living sacrifice which is holy and acceptable to God. You want to give something to God? Give him you, because you're the only one who can do that. No one else can provide that to God except for you. Good point, Denise. So 3 times a year they were to appear before the Lord God. Picking up in Exodus 23:18, it says, "You shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, nor shall the fat of my sacrifice remain until morning. The first of the first fruits in your land you shall bring to the house of the Lord your God. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk." Seems like this is kind of rapid fire here in these 2 verses. There wasn't to be any leaven in the sacrifices. If they brought a grain offering, if they brought something that was baked as a grain offering, there was not to be any leaven in it. It wasn't to be burned up on the altar. You'll see that in Leviticus as well when he gives the prescription for what they are to bring for their grain offerings. There's a lot of detail that is there. The fat of the sacrifice isn't to remain until morning. So if we're talking about the evening burnt offering, when you put that evening burnt offering on there, that fat needs to be burned up. You don't want to leave that. It's going to get rancid, right, if it's sitting on the grill all night and hasn't burned up yet. So especially with the Passover meal, right, they were to eat it all that night. They weren't to have any leftovers. If there was anything left, they were to burn that up. And so there isn't to be anything left of the sacrifice until morning. They need to bring the first fruits of the land, right? That's kind of the idea there with that the Feast of Weeks. That those first fruits, those first things that you gather from the harvest, those are the first things that you ought to be sacrificing to the Lord. And not boiling a young goat in its mother's milk. I'm not sure exactly what this is about. It appears that there was a pagan practice that would be part of their pagan worship, that they would do this, and so this could just be God giving a prescription. Don't do what the Canaanites are doing with regards to worshiping their gods in the land when you get in there. Don't boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Apparently there was supposed to be some sort of magical benefit to doing this in pagan worship. I don't know exactly what that is, but I just reading through several different commentaries, because every time I read this, I think to myself, okay, God said not to do it, but he doesn't really tell them, the whys. They probably understood more the why that was in there than what we do today. The next section, he's going to talk about the angel that's going to go before them, that God's going to bring them into the land. He's going to clear out those that are in the land of Canaan. Elsewhere, he says that there are 7 nations that are in the land of Canaan that are stronger and mightier than the children of Israel, but they don't need to worry about that because God's going to fight for them. God's going to take care of them. Notice it says, "Behold, I send an angel before you to keep you in the way and to bring you into the place which I have prepared. Beware of him and obey his voice. Do not provoke him, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him." So there's an angel. Now it doesn't appear that this is just any angel. God says, "I'm sending an angel before you." And in the New King James, that angel is capitalized because translators believe that's in reference to deity. Again, this appears to be the pre-incarnate Christ that we looked at when we were at the burning bush with Moses. That it was the angel of the Lord who appeared to Moses and told him, "Tell them who has sent you, Moses?" I am, right? "Tell them I am hath sent you." Because he says, I don't know what your name is. When I get to the children of Israel, I say, "God has sent me. I don't even know what your name is." He says, "Tell them I am." And later it says in Exodus chapter 6 that God revealed himself to Moses and the children of Israel as Yahweh, that he hadn't been revealed to Abraham or to Isaac or to Jacob by that name. And when you look at the name Yahweh and you look at the Hebrew verb I am, they are very similar to one another. And really, if you want to translate Yahweh as to what that means, right? I am is the best way of being able to describe God. There's never been a time when God couldn't say, "I am." There's never going to be a time where God can say, "I am," because God exists from eternity to eternity, right? God exists forever, and so he's the ever-existent one. He is I am. And so he says, "Behold, I'm sending an angel before you," right? "Beware of him, obey his voice, don't provoke him." He says, "For my name is in him." Yahweh is one of the ways that the angel of the Lord is referred to in the book of Exodus. that this angel of the Lord that's being spoken of here is in reference to the pre-incarnate Christ. Come over to Acts chapter 7 and verse 35. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen is given his defense before the council. And in verse 35, he's really starting to get on them as far as what they've done. But he's given them a history lesson. He says in verse 35 of Acts 7, "This Moses whom they rejected, saying, 'Who made you a ruler and a judge?' is the one God sent to be a ruler and a deliverer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush." So this angel that's going before them looks like it's the same angel that had spoken to Moses from the burning bush, that this is the pre-incarnate Christ who's going to go before them, whose voice they need to listen to and obey. He's not going to forgive their transgressions. Well, that kind of sounds similar to what we have in the New Testament, doesn't it? That Jesus is the one whose voice we need to listen to, that he's not going to forgive our transgressions, that someday he's going to be the one who's going to make judgment, right? And my name is in him. So he's not just an angel. It looks like God's name being in him could be literally, right, that he's part of the Godhead. He's also referred to as Yahweh, and that he's doing things by the authority of God the Father. It says in verse 22, "But if you indeed obey his voice, do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you into the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Canaanites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, and I will cut them off." When you see that idea of being cut off, right, they're going to be cut off from their people. It doesn't mean exiled. It means killed. When the punishment for adultery is that they will be cut off from their people. Well, you read a little further, you find the punishment for that is death by stoning, right? So cut off. So he's going to cut off. He's going to annihilate, basically, the enemies of Israel. And so God's angel is going to go before him, right? The pre-incarnate Christ is the one who's going to lead them in. They followed the same rock, right? And that rock was Christ. We read about that in the New Testament. That this is the pre-incarnate Christ that they are following here. It's going to be the one who's going to lead them into the land of Canaan. And so when they come in, he says, "I will cut them off." He says, "You shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do according to their works, but you shall utterly overthrow them and completely break down their sacred pillars." When they came into the land of Canaan, they weren't to have anything to do with those folks, right? They weren't to make any agreements with them. They weren't to make any covenants with them. They weren't to worship their gods. They were to take all the idols that they found and they were to tear them down, because God knew if they didn't do that, if they didn't remove all of that from the land, what was going to happen? They're going to turn to those things, right? It's going to be a snare to them. They're going to get comfortable living with those people in the land. They're going to inquire about what their gods are. They're going to say, "Oh, that seems like a fun worship service. Let me go do that." And well, maybe God's God, and maybe this is God, and so I'm going to make sure that I've covered, my bets. I've hedged my bet, and just in case. And they're going to be practicing a lot of idolatry and doing things that God doesn't want them to do. And God knows that's going to happen. He warned them ahead of time. Don't do that. Get rid of all those things when you come into the land. But unfortunately, we know that they didn't do that. We wouldn't have the book of Judges if they had just done what God wanted them to do. Comments or questions on these things? All right, thanks for your attention and participation.